Welcome back, my name's Steve and this is my photography journey. In September 2022, one of the first videos that I made on this channel was about the exposure triangle, and I want to revisit that and see whether my opinions have changed, whether the information that I would give has changed based on these couple of years of extra experience that I've had taking pictures, recording videos, and basically going through this photography journey. There are three different elements that make up the exposure of an image, and that's where the name exposure triangle came from. So each of these elements impacts each other. If you change one of them, you need to make changes to the other two to get the overall exposure how you want it to be. And what is exposure? Exposure is overall how light or how dark the photo is, whether you've got really dark areas, really light areas, and if you go beyond what's a good exposure, you end up with no detail, and same if you go too dark, you end up with no detail down there either. So that's why we want to control exposure to make the picture look as good as it can do. So what are these three elements? There's ISO, there is the shutter speed, and there is the aperture. First up is the aperture. The aperture is how much light comes through the lens into the camera. So this is determined by basically the size of the hole in the lens that's allowing the light to come through. This is measured in f-stops. So I'm currently filming this on an f1.8 lens, and that's as wide open as it can go. That's as much light as can come into it. And it can also go to something like f16, so a larger number, which means that there's a smaller hole, so less light comes through the lens and into the camera and onto that sensor. As well as controlling the amount of light that comes through, a wider aperture will give a narrower depth of field. So things behind me, when the camera is focusing on me, things behind me will look more blurred than if it was at a bigger a larger numbered aperture, so a smaller hole, and that's due to how light travels. So when you've got a wider opening, more light can come in from different angles, whereas a smaller opening will only allow light to come in a straight direction. So a smaller number will have a more blurred background, a larger number will have more things in focus. Shutter speed. This is how quickly the picture is taken by the camera, how long that shutter is open for. So in a camera, the shutter lifts up to expose the sensor to the light, then it closes again. This is either an electronic thing, a mechanical shutter. It doesn't really matter how it's done. The thing that matters is how long the sensor is exposed to the light for. And this can be anywhere from 30 seconds, a minute, as long as you want, all the way down to an 8,000th, a 16,000th of a second. So very, very quick times. Obviously, the longer the time that the shutter is open, the more light will get in. So if you want to freeze action, you need a quick shutter speed so that things don't move while the shutter is open. But if you want to blur something, for example, running water or car brake lights or something like that, you need a longer time for the shutter to be open so that things move within the frame over that time period, and that's what gives you that blurred look. Then the third element of the triangle is ISO, and this is kind of your volume control. It's what happens to that light when it comes in, how much the camera boosts it up digitally. So fake light, basically. The higher the number, the more that light gets boosted up to make your picture lighter. However, the problem there is that the more that you're doing that artificially, the more noise can be introduced, little grains and things in the image, which can be quite a nice thing. Depending on what your picture is, having that grainy look can look really good. If you don't want it, there are also things like Lightroom offers some denoise algorithms to help get rid of that and make things look a lot smoother. So that's another option. So it's balancing these three different things to get the picture that you want at the end of it. So to recap, you've got your shutter speed, which can either freeze action or give a blurred look. You've got your aperture, which can either give a big field of view so everything's in focus, or it can give a really narrow depth of field so that only one thing is in focus, and then ISO, which makes your picture lighter or darker, but can introduce grain. So balancing these three aspects is where the exposure triangle comes in, because if you change one of them, then that's going to affect the amount of light coming into the camera. So you have to change the others to compensate in order to still get a balanced exposure. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of my pictures where I've taken different settings and see what the outcome is with them. So this picture that I took in Ireland recently is a good example of what I mean by this. So it's not the most exciting of pictures, but at the front you can see there's this area of lavender, and in the back is the hill, the sky, and things like that. So you can see that the lavender at the front is in focus, and you can see that the background is out of focus. So I've used a smaller depth of field, so I've used a bigger opening for my aperture. And as you can see, this is f1.8. That means a lot of light is coming into the camera because you've got a bigger hole for the light to come through. So in order to not be overexposed in this picture, I need to compensate. So I've dropped my ISO as low as I can. So 100 is as low as I can get it on the Z30. So there's no amplification to the light that's coming in. However, it was still a really bright light morning, so I needed to compensate for that light by not opening the shutter for so long. So as you can see, my shutter speed here was 1/4000th of a second. So that's the very short period of time that the shutter was open to capture this image. So there's going to be no blurring. Things aren't going to move between the shutter opening and the shutter closing. Everything is quite still in the picture and everything is frozen in time. And that's the look that you get with these particular settings. So let's contrast that to a picture that I took in Milan on another work trip. This was in the evening at the castle. And what you can see here is that for my aperture, it's f5.3, so it's a lot smaller hole, so not as much light gets through. And that's because of the lens that I have. That was the maximum sized aperture that I could have on that particular lens. So obviously your kit has an impact on what you can do in terms of these settings. So I could go to f5.3 for that. And the ISO therefore was larger. So I had more of a boost of the light coming in using the ISO. And that was up to 2500. And I chose that number because it meant that I could have a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. So still quite quick, really, but that's the minimum level that I'm happy hand-holding for a picture like this. So knowing that I don't want to go any slower on my shutter speed, I had to then increase my ISO up to that 2500 at the risk of increasing more grain and things like that in the picture. But that gave me the settings that I needed to get enough light into the camera to expose properly. And even then it's still a bit dark, I think. But these different settings can, as you can see, have a major impact on the photograph that you're taking. And as another example, this is the cruise ship in Norway that we went on recently. And I wanted to get a bit more of the background into focus this time. So I've deliberately chosen f9, and that was my starting point for this picture. So f9, shutter speed, again, relatively slow because it wasn't the brightest day, and remember that an f9 aperture is smaller, so it will allow less light into the camera. But I also didn't want to boost my ISO too much. I could have increased it a bit more here, but I try and leave it on 100 as much as I can. So that meant that shutter speed of 100, ISO of 100, so shutter speed is 1/100th of a second, and an aperture of f9 is the settings that I used to take this picture to get as much in focus as possible, but still capture things without them moving too much. So as you can see, there's various different techniques that you can use depending on what you want to capture in your picture. So it's getting this balance of your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture, to make that picture as exposed as you want it to be. And you can use them for different creative tasks to make something more prominent, less prominent, blurred, frozen in time. It entirely depends what you're taking a picture of. The thing is to practice. Use your camera, learn where these settings are, how to control them, how to move quickly from a aperture of 1.8 to an aperture of 9, so that when that particular picture needs to be taken, you can do it without paying much attention to it. And you only learn that by going out, taking the pictures and doing it. Thank you for joining me on my photography journey today. I hope that was useful for you, and I'll be back again next week with a new topic. So have a great week, and I'll see you then. Bye.